The sun hung low over Red Ridge Pass, casting long shadows across the dusty trail as Clementine Hayes guided her stagecoach with steady hands. Her weathered hat pulled low over her eyes, she appeared nothing more than a simple driver to anyone who passed by. But appearances, as they say, can be deceiving. The first sign of trouble came with the distant thunder of hooves. The Thunder Gulch Gang, notorious outlaws of the territory, emerged from the rocky outcrops like shadows taking form. Their leader, Duke Carver, pulled his horse to a halt atop a ridge, his cruel laugh echoing across the valley. "Well, boys, looks like we got ourselves some entertainment today," Duke called out, his voice carrying a mocking edge. "They're letting women drive stages now?" The gang's laughter rolled through the canyon like thunder. Clementine didn't flinch, didn't even adjust her grip on the reins. Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, tracked every movement of the bandits as they spread out along the ridge. To them, she looked like easy prey, a woman alone on a dangerous trail. They couldn't have been more wrong. "Maybe she got lost on her way to the kitchen," one of the bandits sneered, causing another round of cruel laughter. Clementine's lips curved into the faintest smile, one that held secrets these men couldn't begin to understand. What they saw was a woman out of place, vulnerable and alone. What they didn't see was the legend they'd been whispering about in saloons across the territory. They didn't see the quick-draw artist who'd outshot some of the deadliest gunslingers in the West. They didn't see the Desert Rose. The gang began their descent, horses picking their way down the rocky slope with practiced ease. Duke led them, confidence radiating from his posture as he approached the stagecoach. "Now, little lady," he called out, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "Why don't you just step down nice and easy? Wouldn't want anyone getting hurt over something silly like pride." Clementine's hands remained steady on the reins, her posture relaxed despite the danger surrounding her. The sun glinted off something metallic beneath her coat, a detail the bandits were too busy laughing to notice. "5 against 1, Duke continued, drawing closer. "And you being a woman, well, let's just say the odds aren't in your favor." His gang spread out around the coach, their confidence growing with each passing moment. They didn't notice how Clementine's eyes tracked each movement with calculated precision. They didn't see how her right hand rested near her hip, inches from a weapon that had become legend throughout the West. They had no idea they were about to learn why whispers of the Desert Rose struck fear into the hearts of outlaws across the territory. The tension built as Duke pulled his horse alongside the coach, reaching out to grab the reins. "Time to step down, sweetheart," he sneered. "Unless you think you can take on the Thunder Gulch Gang all by yourself?" Tell us in the comments, have you ever been underestimated like Clementine? Share your story of proving others wrong. The reputation of the Desert Rose was one whispered in saloons and around campfires across the territory. Some said she was a ghost, a vengeful spirit who appeared when outlaws least expected it. Others claimed she was faster than lightning, her bullets finding their mark before anyone could blink. In the Last Chance Saloon just last week, a grizzled prospector had sworn on his mother's grave that he'd seen her take down 6 men without drawing a second breath. "Eyes like fire," he'd said, hands trembling around his whiskey glass. "An aim so true it'd make the devil himself think twice." But none of those stories captured the full truth of who she really was. None of them knew that the legendary Desert Rose now sat calmly atop a stagecoach, surrounded by bandits who thought they'd found easy prey. "You know what they say about the Desert Rose?" Duke taunted, still holding the reins of Clementine's coach. "They say she's the deadliest shot in the West, but you ain't her, are you, sweetheart?" His gang laughed, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. Clementine remembered the first time she'd heard tales of her alter ego. It had been in a crowded saloon in Tombstone, where a young man with too much whiskey in his blood had been regaling the crowd with stories of her exploits. "They say she once shot the spurs off a man's boots while he was running," he'd declared. "Shot him clean off without drawing a drop of blood." That part, at least, was true, though she'd only done it to prove a point to a particularly stubborn marshal who doubted her abilities. The Thunder Gulch Gang continued to circle her stagecoach, their confidence growing with each passing moment. They'd heard the legends too. Everyone had. But none of them made the connection between those tales and the quiet woman before them. "You know what else they say about the Desert Rose?" Another bandit chimed in, adjusting his gun belt. "They say she's got eyes in the back of her head, that she can sense trouble coming before it arrives." He spat in the dust. "Load of hogwash, if you ask me." Clementine's lips curved into another slight smile. That particular rumor had started after she'd outmaneuvered an ambush in Silver Creek, sensing the trap before it could be sprung. Sometimes the best legends were the ones based in truth. Duke leaned closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "But you ain't nothing like that legend, are you? You're just a woman who doesn't know her place." His hand moved toward his gun, a gesture meant to intimidate. "Now why don't you save us all some trouble and step down from that coach?" The air grew thick with tension as Clementine finally turned to face him fully. The setting sun cast her features in sharp relief, and for just a moment, something in her eyes made Duke's confidence waver. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. The Thunder Gulch Gang had pulled their horses in tight around the stagecoach, forming a circle that left no obvious route for escape. Duke Carver dismounted with deliberate slowness, his spurs jingling against the hard-packed earth as he approached the driver's side. "Last chance to make this easy," he drawled, resting his hand on his gun belt. "Though I gotta admit, watching you try to be brave is mighty entertaining." His gang members chuckled, their horses shifting restlessly beneath them. Clementine adjusted her position slightly, her movements casual yet precise. "Seems to me," she said, her voice carrying a calm that unsettled Duke, though he'd never admit it, "that you boys are the ones making things difficult." Her response drew more laughter from the gang, but it was tinged with uncertainty. Something about her composure didn't fit their expectations of a frightened woman alone on the trail. "Listen here," Duke snarled, his patience wearing thin. "I don't much like having to repeat myself to anyone, especially not some woman who thinks she can play at being a stage driver." He took another step forward, his boot heels crunching in the gravel. "Get down or we'll make you get down." Clementine's eyes swept across the gang members, noting their positions with practiced precision. The youngest one, barely more than a boy, had his horse too close to the edge of the path. The heavily bearded man to her right was favoring his left side, likely nursing an old injury. Details that could mean the difference between life and death in what was about to unfold. "You know," she said, her voice carrying just enough edge to make Duke pause, "I've heard tell of the Thunder Gulch Gang. Heard you've been causing trouble up and down these trails." She adjusted her grip on the reins, her movements deliberately slow. "Also heard you've been running from the Desert Rose." Duke's face darkened at the mention of the legendary gunslinger. "That's none of your concern, woman. The Desert Rose is just a story meant to scare children and fools." "Is that so?" Clementine's question hung in the air like gun smoke. "Then why do you keep looking over your shoulder, Mr. Carver?" The use of his name caught Duke off guard. His hand tightened on his gun belt as he glared up at her. "How do you know my name?" "I know a lot of things," Clementine replied, her calm demeanor never wavering. "I know, for instance, that you're about to make a very big mistake." The tension in the air grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Duke's face contorted with rage as he drew his gun, pointing it directly at her. "Get down from that coach right now, or I swear I'll—" His threat was cut short by the subtle but unmistakable sound of a hammer being cocked. The source of the sound wasn't immediately apparent, but its meaning was clear as crystal. The time for talking was over. Duke's hand shot out like a rattlesnake, striking, aiming to grab Clementine's arm and drag her from the coach. But his fingers closed on empty air as she moved with liquid grace, rolling sideways off the driver's seat. The sharp crack of a gunshot split the air, and Duke's hat went spinning into the dust. A neat hole punched through its brim. "That," Clementine said calmly, her gun steady in her hand, "was your only warning shot." She stood behind the coach now, using it for cover as the Thunder Gulch Gang scrambled to respond. Their horses danced nervously, sensing the sudden shift in the air. Duke touched his head in disbelief, feeling where the bullet had passed just inches from his scalp. "Shoot her!" he bellowed, diving for cover behind a nearby boulder. His gang drew their weapons, but Clementine was already moving. 2 more shots rang out in quick succession. The heavily bearded man yelped as his gun went flying from his hand, and the youngest gang member's horse reared in panic as a bullet kicked up dust between its hooves. The precision of her shots left no doubt. These weren't lucky hits. "Now," Clementine called out, her voice carrying across the pass, "I suggest you boys reconsider your plans for the day." She moved like a shadow around the coach, making it impossible for them to track her position. "I'd hate to have to do something permanent." The gang members exchanged uncertain glances. This wasn't how their robberies usually went. The woman they'd mistaken for easy prey was handling her gun with the skill of a seasoned gunslinger, and there was something eerily familiar about her style. Duke, his face red with rage and humiliation, tried to rally his men. "She's just one woman! We've got her outnumbered!" But even as he spoke, another shot rang out, and his gun belt fell to the ground, the strap neatly severed. "Numbers don't mean much when you're dealing with the right woman," Clementine replied. She stepped into view, but this time her stance had changed. Gone was any pretense of being a simple stage driver. She stood with the confident posture of someone who had faced down far worse odds than this. The young gang member was the first to make the connection. "Boss," he stammered, his face pale. "The way she shoots, it's just like the stories about—" "Shut up," Duke snapped, but doubt had crept into his eyes. He'd heard those same stories, whispered in saloons and around campfires. Stories of a gunslinger who could shoot the fleas off a dog at 50 paces, who moved like a ghost and struck with deadly precision. Clementine twirled her gun with practiced ease before sliding it back into its holster. "You boys have a choice to make," she said, her eyes locked on Duke. "And I suggest you make it carefully." The sun caught the silver rose etched into her gun's handle, a detail that had been hidden until now. The Thunder Gulch Gang was about to learn why some legends were best left undisturbed. The warm desert air carried the scent of sage as Clementine's mind drifted back to her childhood, to the lessons that had shaped her into who she was today. Her father, James Hayes, had been a legend in his own right, though few knew the quiet rancher was once the most feared lawman west of the Mississippi. "The gun doesn't make the shooter, Clemmy," he'd told her one morning as the sun painted the mountains gold. She'd been just 12, holding her first revolver with trembling hands. "It's the heart behind it that matters." Every morning before the ranch work began, he'd taught her, not just how to shoot, but when to shoot, and more importantly, when not to. "Anyone can pull a trigger," he'd say, adjusting her stance with gentle hands. "But knowing why you're pulling it, that's what separates the living from the dead." The memory of his voice was as clear as the day he'd spoken those words, just as clear as the day 3 years later when the Scorpion Gang had ambushed him outside their ranch. They'd heard rumors about the retired lawman, wanted to make a name for themselves. Her father had died as he lived, protecting others, giving his family time to escape. Clementine's grip tightened on her gun as the memories washed over her. After her father's death, she dedicated herself to mastering everything he'd taught her. Every sunrise found her practicing. Every sunset saw her hands raw from handling guns and ropes. She became more than just good. She became exceptional. The legend of the Desert Rose had been born on a dusty afternoon much like this one, 2 years after her father's death. A gang of outlaws had attacked a school wagon, and Clementine had been the only one close enough to help. She'd worn a bandana that day, a faded cloth with a rose pattern her mother had sewn. When the dust settled, 6 outlaws lay wounded but alive, disarmed by shots so precise they seemed impossible. The children had whispered about the mysterious woman with the rose bandana, and the legend had grown from there. Now, standing before the Thunder Gulch Gang, Clementine felt her father's presence beside her. The same gang that had been terrorizing innocent travelers would soon learn what happened when they pushed the wrong person too far. "A gun's just a tool, Clemmy," her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Like a plow or a rope. It's how you use it that matters." She'd taken those words to heart, becoming someone who protected rather than hunted, who disabled rather than killed. The Desert Rose hadn't earned her reputation through death, but through an almost supernatural ability to disarm and defeat any opponent without taking their life. It was her father's final lesson. Mercy could be more powerful than violence. As she faced down the Thunder Gulch Gang, Clementine knew this moment would add another chapter to her legend. But more importantly, it would honor everything her father had taught her about justice, mercy, and standing up for what was right. The Thunder Gulch Gang regrouped with remarkable speed, spreading out in a familiar attack pattern that had served them well in countless robberies. But they'd never faced an opponent like Clementine before. "Take her down!" Duke roared, his pride stinging more than any wound. Bullets began flying, kicking up dust around the stagecoach as Clementine moved with practiced precision. She rolled beneath the coach as shots peppered the ground where she'd stood moments before. The gang's confidence grew as they lost sight of her, but that confidence was premature. A shot rang out from beneath the vehicle, and one of the bandits howled as his gun went spinning from his grip. "Keep shooting!" Duke commanded, but his voice carried an edge of desperation now. "She can't hide forever!" Clementine moved like water through the chaos, each movement calculated and smooth. She emerged on the opposite side of the coach, firing 2 rapid shots that disarmed another gang member before he could even register her presence. The young outlaw tried to circle behind her, but Clementine had already anticipated his move. Without even turning around, she fired a shot that knocked his hat clean off his head. He froze, realizing how close he'd come to death, and understanding that she'd chosen to spare him. "3 down," Clementine called out, her voice carrying across the battlefield. "Want to try for 4? She used the terrain to her advantage, moving between rocks and using the coach as cover. The remaining gang members fired wildly, their shots going wide as panic began to set in. Duke, realizing his men were losing their nerve, attempted to rally them. "She's just one person! We've taken down whole posses before!" But even as he spoke, another shot rang out, and his remaining gun went flying from his holster, landing in the dust several feet away. The gang's formation had completely broken down now. They were shooting blindly, wasting ammunition and creating more chaos than damage. Clementine moved through their disarray like a ghost, each shot finding its mark with supernatural accuracy. Another bandit's gun went flying, then another. The young outlaw had already dropped his weapon, hands raised in surrender. The heavily bearded man followed suit, recognizing the futility of their situation. Through it all, Clementine hadn't taken a single life. Every shot had been precisely calculated to disarm, to disable, but never to kill. It was this skill, this incredible precision, that had helped build the legend of the Desert Rose. The last gang member standing beside Duke threw down his weapon, falling to his knees in the dust. "Please," he begged. We didn't know who you were." Duke stood alone now, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. All around him lay his disarmed gang members, some nursing minor wounds, others simply staring in awe at the woman who had single-handedly defeated them. The dust began to settle, revealing Clementine standing calmly in the center of the chaos. Her gun was still smoking, but her hand was steady. The setting sun cast her shadow long across the ground, making her appear larger than life. The realization hit Duke like a physical blow. He'd seen this shooting style before, heard tales of it around countless campfires. The way she moved, the impossible accuracy, the mercy in her shots, it all added up to one terrifying conclusion. "No," he whispered, his face draining of color. "It can't be. You're the Desert Rose?" His voice cracked on the legendary name, drawing gasps from his defeated gang members. Clementine stepped forward, holstering her smoking gun with fluid grace. "Took you long enough to figure it out?" she said, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. "Though I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. You boys were too busy laughing at a woman to notice who she really was." The young outlaw's eyes went wide with recognition. "The silver rose on her gun," he stammered. "The stories were true. They said she never kills, just disarms. Said she can shoot the buttons off your coat while you're running." Duke's mind raced through every story he'd heard about the Desert Rose. The mysterious gunslinger who'd appeared 2 years ago, becoming a nightmare for every outlaw gang in the territory. The shooter who could thread a bullet through a wedding ring at 50 paces. The legend who'd never been identified, because no one had thought to look for a woman. "All this time," Duke said, his voice hollow, "all this time we've been running from the Desert Rose, and you were right here, driving stages in plain sight." His hands trembled as he looked at his disarmed gang, at the precision shots that had disabled their weapons without drawing blood. Clementine walked closer, each step deliberate. The setting sun caught the silver rose emblem on her gun, making it gleam like a star. "A woman can be many things, Mr. Carver. A stage driver, a shooter, a legend." She stopped in front of him. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before judging someone by what you expect to see." The other gang members remained frozen, some still on their knees, others standing with their hands raised. They'd heard stories of the Desert Rose's skill, but seeing it in person had left them shaken to their core. "The real mystery," Clementine continued, her eyes locked on Duke, "is what happens next. You and your boys have been terrorizing these trails for months. The Desert Rose has a reputation for dealing with men like you." Duke swallowed hard, remembering all the stories of how she'd handled other gangs. None had died by her hand, but all had faced justice one way or another. Some had turned themselves in, too afraid to risk facing her again. Others had fled the territory, their reputations in shambles. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of wind through the canyon. Duke Carver, the feared leader of the Thunder Gulch Gang, stood face to face with the legend he'd dismissed as mere stories. And for the first time in his life, he felt true fear. The Desert Rose had revealed herself, and the Thunder Gulch Gang's fate now hung in the balance. The sun climbed higher in the sky, reaching its zenith as Duke Carver and Clementine Hayes faced each other in the dusty road. The defeated gang members watched in tense silence, knowing they were about to witness something that would be talked about in saloons for years to come. "One shot," Duke said, his voice carrying across the still air. "You and me. Winner takes all." His hand twitched near his fallen gun, still lying in the dust where Clementine's bullet had sent it. Clementine's expression remained unchanged. "You sure that's what you want, Mr. Carver? You've already seen what I can do." Her words carried no mockery, just simple truth. Duke's face flushed red. "I won't let it be said that Duke Carver was taken down without a proper fight, not even by the Desert Rose herself." He glanced at his gun, then back at her. "Let me pick it up. Give me that much dignity at least." The other gang members held their breath. They'd seen their leader in countless gunfights before, but this was different. The Desert Rose's reputation wasn't built on tall tales. They'd just witnessed her skill firsthand. "Very well," Clementine agreed, stepping back. "Pick up your weapon, Mr. Carver, but remember, this was your choice." Duke moved slowly, bending to retrieve his fallen gun. The metal felt hot in his hand, warmed by the midday sun. He checked the chambers. 3 bullets left, more than enough for what was about to happen. They took their positions 20 paces apart. The sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat trickled down Duke's forehead. Clementine stood perfectly still, her posture relaxed but alert. "On the count of 3, Duke called out, his voice betraying a slight tremor. "Like civilized folks." The young gang member, still in awe of what he was witnessing, stepped forward to count. "1," he called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. Duke's fingers flexed near his holster. He'd built his reputation on being quick. Quick to draw, quick to shoot, quick to kill. But as he watched Clementine's calm demeanor, doubt crept into his mind. 2. Clementine hadn't moved a muscle. The wind rustled her coat, revealing glimpses of the legendary gun at her hip. The silver rose caught the sunlight, flashing like a signal. 3. Time seemed to slow as both hands moved toward their weapons. Duke drew fast, faster than he'd ever drawn before. His gun cleared leather in a blur of motion, rising toward his target. But Clementine was faster. Her movement was so quick it seemed impossible, like lightning striking from a clear sky. The crack of her gun split the air before Duke's weapon was even level. The shot echoed through the canyon, followed by a metallic clang as Duke's gun went spinning from his hand once again. A perfect bullet hole punched through its barrel. The duel was over before it had truly begun. Duke stared at his ruined gun lying in the dust, his hand still frozen in position from where the weapon had been shot away. The barrel's new hole smoked slightly in the sunlight, a testament to Clementine's impossible accuracy. "That's..." Duke stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "That's not possible. No one can shoot like that." But the evidence lay at his feet, and 20 witnesses had just watched it happen. Clementine holstered her weapon with fluid grace, her movements unhurried and precise. "Your gun's finished, Mr. Carver, just like your reputation." She stepped forward, boots crunching in the gravel. "But you're still breathing. That's more than most would have given you." The other gang members remained motionless, their eyes darting between their defeated leader and the woman who had so thoroughly outmatched him. The young outlaw whispered a prayer under his breath, crossing himself as though he'd witnessed something supernatural. "You could have killed me," Duke said, his voice hollow with realization. "Could have killed any of us. Why didn't you?" Clementine's eyes softened slightly, though her posture remained alert. "Because death is easy, Mr. Carver. Living with the consequences of your choices, that's the real challenge." She glanced at the other gang members. "Each of you has a choice to make now." Duke's legs gave out, and he sank to his knees in the dust. The feared leader of the Thunder Gulch Gang had been reduced to this, kneeling before a woman he'd mocked just hours earlier. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. "The desert rose," he muttered, shaking his head. "All this time, we've been running from stories about some mysterious gunslinger, and here you were, hiding in plain sight." He looked up at her, his expression a mix of fear and respect. "How many others like you are out there? How many women have we underestimated?" Clementine allowed herself a small smile. "That's a lesson you'll have to figure out for yourself, Mr. Carver, assuming you live long enough to learn from it." The sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the canyon floor. The moment stretched between them, heavy with the weight of what had transpired. In the space of one afternoon, the Thunder Gulch Gang had been dismantled, their fearsome reputation shattered by a woman they'd thought would be an easy target. "The law's coming," Clementine announced, her voice carrying to all present. "They'll be here within the hour. What happens next is up to you." She stepped back, giving them space to make their decision. Duke remained on his knees, the fight completely drained from him. His gang watched him, waiting for guidance, but their leader had nothing left to give. The Desert Rose had done more than just defeat them. She'd broken their spirit. The legend of the Desert Rose had grown that day, though not in the way anyone might have expected. Sometimes the most powerful victories weren't won with bullets, but with the choice to show mercy. The defeated gang members huddled together, their faces a mix of fear and uncertainty as they faced their moment of decision. Clementine stood calmly, her presence both reassuring and intimidating as she waited for their choice. "She's offering us a chance," the young outlaw whispered, his voice trembling. "More than most would do." His eyes darted between his fellow gang members, seeking support. "I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm done. This life, it ain't worth dying for." The heavily bearded man nodded slowly. "Kid's right. We've been running so long I almost forgot what it was like to live honest." He unbuckled his gun belt, letting it fall to the ground. "I got family in Missouri. Maybe it's time I paid them a visit." One by one, most of the gang members laid down their weapons, each making their own decision to walk away from the outlaw life. But not everyone was ready to surrender so easily. 3 men remained armed, their faces twisted with defiance. "This is foolishness," one of them spat, his hand hovering near his holster. "We're just gonna let some woman destroy everything we built?" His eyes burned with desperate anger. "Duke might have lost his nerve, but I ain't backing down." Clementine watched them carefully, noting their positions and the tension in their stances. "Think carefully about your next move, gentlemen. You've seen what I can do. Don't make me demonstrate it again." Duke, still on his knees, looked up at his remaining loyal men. "Stand down," he said, his voice hollow. "It's over. The Desert Rose. She's more than we bargained for, more than anyone bargained for." The 3 men exchanged glances, their resolve wavering. The stories of the Desert Rose had spread far and wide for a reason, and they'd just witnessed those tales come to life before their eyes. "Last chance," Clementine announced, her hand resting casually near her gun. "The law's getting closer with every passing minute. Make your choice while you still can." 2 of the men finally relented, throwing their weapons into the growing pile of surrendered arms. But the third, a scarred man with cold eyes, remained defiant. "I ain't surrendering to no woman," he growled, his fingers twitching near his gun. "Legend or no legend." The tension in the air grew thick enough to cut with a knife. The other gang members backed away, sensing what was about to unfold. Even Duke closed his eyes, unable to watch another demonstration of the Desert Rose's legendary skills. "That's not a choice I'd recommend," Clementine said softly, her voice carrying a note of genuine regret. "But if you insist on learning the hard way—" She left the sentence unfinished, letting the implications hang in the desert air. The scarred man's face contorted with rage as he made his final, fatal decision. His hand moved toward his gun, but everyone present knew it was already too late. The scarred man's draw was fast, faster than most gunslingers could match. But Clementine was already moving, her reflexes honed by years of practice and countless battles. Before his gun cleared leather, 2 shots rang out in rapid succession. The first bullet knocked his weapon from his hand with surgical precision. The second shot clipped his hat brim, sending it spinning into the dust. The man stood frozen, his empty hand still hovering where his gun had been moments before. "That's twice now I've chosen not to kill you," Clementine said quietly. "There won't be a third time." Her gun remained steady, trained on the scarred man who now trembled visibly. "On your knees, now." He complied, all resistance finally drained from his body. The remaining gang members watched in stunned silence as the last holdout was brought low by the Desert Rose's impossible marksmanship. But the danger wasn't over. Movement caught Clementine's eye, a glint of metal from behind a distant rock. During the confusion, 2 more gang members had slipped away, circling around to set up an ambush. "Really, boys?" she called out, not taking her eyes off the scarred man. "After everything you've seen today, you still want to try your luck?" A rifle barrel emerged from behind the rock, followed by a nervous voice. "You can't watch all of us at once. Even the Desert Rose has to sleep sometime." Clementine sighed, a sound of genuine disappointment. "I was hoping we could end this without any more demonstrations." Her gun moved in a blur, 3 shots echoing across the canyon in rapid succession. The rifle went spinning from the hidden man's hands. His companion's gun belt was severed, dropping his weapon to the ground. The third shot knocked a knife from another man's boot, one he hadn't even reached for yet. "Would anyone else like to test their luck against the Desert Rose?" Clementine asked, her voice carrying across the stunned silence. No one moved. No one dared. The sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention. The law was getting closer, just as Clementine had warned. The defeated gang members looked to her, perhaps hoping for one last chance at mercy. "You've all made your choices," she said firmly. "Now you'll have to live with them. She gestured for them to group together, keeping her gun ready. Those who surrendered peacefully will have that noted. Those who chose to fight. She glanced at the scarred man and his would-be ambushers. Well, the law takes a dim view of attempting to shoot an unarmed woman. The irony of her words wasn't lost on anyone present. The Desert Rose had proven herself anything but unarmed or helpless. Yet the law would see only what they expected to see, just as the Thunder Gulch Gang had done to their own downfall. The hoofbeats grew louder as justice approached. The legend of the Desert Rose was about to grow even larger, though few would believe the true story of how she had ended the reign of the Thunder Gulch Gang. The local sheriff and his posse crested the hill just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the scattered members of the Thunder Gulch Gang. Their jaws dropped at the scene before them. 20 of the territory's most notorious outlaws, all disarmed and subdued by what appeared to be a simple stage driver. "Miss Hayes?" Sheriff Cooper called out in disbelief, reining his horse to a stop. "Are you all right? We got word the Thunder Gulch Gang was—" His voice trailed off as he took in the scene, noting the bullet-marked guns lying in the dust. "I'm fine, Sheriff," Clementine replied calmly, keeping her gun trained on the gang. "Just had a slight delay in my route. These gentlemen needed a lesson in manners." Duke Carver looked up at the lawman, his face a mask of resignation. "Sheriff, you're not going to believe what happened here today, though I doubt anyone will." He glanced at Clementine with a mix of fear and respect. "We've been running from the Desert Rose all this time, and she was right under our noses." The sheriff's eyes widened as understanding dawned. He looked at Clementine with new appreciation, pieces of a long-standing puzzle finally falling into place. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered. "All this time?" Clementine holstered her weapon as the deputies began rounding up the gang members. "They're all yours, Sheriff. Most of them surrendered peacefully. A few needed more convincing." She nodded toward the scarred man and his failed ambushers. "Those ones might need extra attention." The young outlaw, being led away in handcuffs, turned back to face her. "Miss Hayes, Desert Rose, ma'am, thank you for showing mercy, for giving us a choice." His eyes were sincere. "I won't waste the chance you gave us." Sheriff Cooper supervised as his men secured the prisoners. "The reward money's yours," he told Clementine. "The Thunder Gulch Gang's been terrorizing these parts for months, though something tells me you're not in it for the money." Clementine mounted her stagecoach, adjusting her hat against the setting sun. "Keep it, Sheriff. Use it to help the folks they've hurt." She gathered the reins, preparing to resume her journey. "Just remember, next time you hear someone say a woman can't handle herself, think of today." Duke Carver, being led toward the prison wagon, called out one last time. "They'll never believe it was you, that the Desert Rose was a woman stage driver all along." Clementine smiled, a rare full smile that transformed her face. "That's exactly why it worked, Mr. Carver. Sometimes the best place to hide is right in plain sight." She clicked to her horses, starting them forward. "Besides, I've got stages to drive. The Desert Rose only appears when she's needed." The sheriff and his men watched as she drove away, the legendary gunslinger returning to her simple cover as a stage driver. The Thunder Gulch Gang's reign of terror was over, and a new chapter in the legend of the Desert Rose had begun. Word of what happened at Red Ridge Pass spread like wildfire across the territory. In every saloon and at every campfire, people whispered about how the Thunder Gulch Gang had finally met their match. The story grew with each telling, becoming grander and more incredible with every retelling. Some said she'd shot the guns out of 20 men's hands with a single bullet. Others claimed she could split a playing card edgewise at 100 paces. The legend of the Desert Rose bloomed anew, taking on a life of its own. But Clementine Hayes simply returned to her route, driving stages across the dusty trails as she'd always done. Few connected the quiet woman at the reins with the legendary gunslinger who had become the talk of the territory. That was exactly how she wanted it. "Did you hear about the Desert Rose?" passengers would ask as she drove them through the same pass where she'd faced down the Thunder Gulch Gang. They say she appeared out of nowhere and took down Duke Carver's whole gang single-handed. Clementine would simply nod, hiding her smile beneath the brim of her hat. Let them have their stories, their mysteries. The truth was far more powerful, that sometimes the most extraordinary heroes could be found in the most ordinary places. The Thunder Gulch Gang faced justice, just as she'd promised. Most served their time, changed by their encounter with the Desert Rose. The young outlaw made good on his word, returning to his family in Kansas and leaving his criminal past behind. Even Duke Carver found a kind of peace behind bars, often telling fellow inmates about the day he learned not to judge someone by their appearance. But more importantly, something else changed in the territory. Women began to be seen differently, treated with more respect. After all, if the legendary Desert Rose could be hiding behind any feminine face, who knew what other capabilities might be concealed beneath society's expectations? Clementine kept driving her stage routes and kept protecting those who needed it. Sometimes on quiet nights at isolated stations, she'd pull out her gun and polish the silver rose emblem, remembering her father's words about using power wisely and showing mercy when possible. The Desert Rose would appear again when needed, emerging from the simple disguise of a stage driver to defend the innocent and fight injustice. But for now, Clementine was content with her quiet life, knowing that her legend served a greater purpose than mere fame. As she guided her stage along the familiar trails, she smiled at the thought of all those who had underestimated her. The Thunder Gulch Gang had learned a valuable lesson that day, one that would be remembered for generations to come. Never judge someone by what you expect to see, for behind the most unassuming exterior might lurk a legend, waiting for the right moment to bloom like a rose in the desert. If you enjoyed this incredible story of the Desert Rose, make sure to like and subscribe for more amazing tales of courage and redemption. And tell us in the comments, what's your favorite legendary hero story? We'd love to hear from you.